My name is Chris Seipel. I'm with the Institute for Global Engagement. We are a think and do tank that works on building, not just promoting, religious freedom worldwide through local partnerships, which is to say we like to work top down and bottom up, simultaneously and transparently with government and grassroots to find ways where people of all faiths and none can be equal in contributing citizens to a flourishing society. And it's my privilege to be with you today as the moderator of this panel on the challenge of religious pluralism in Christian-Muslim relations, the Arab Spring. And we have three fantastic friends and esteemed experts to discuss this. By way of introduction, I just want to ask three questions and then turn it over to them so we can get the conversation going. And also in light of this morning's conversation, which I was very encouraged by, both of them, as themselves exhibits of freedom of conscience and agreeing to disagree peaceably. But the first question is this: what is religious freedom? I know that's not the subject per se, but I think it's important for us to have our worldview and our faith speak into that. And maybe in a sentence or two, if you could say what it means to you. Because clearly there are different worldviews and different understandings, and we need to know how the other thinks about it before we can begin to relate to him or her on the issue. So I think that's pretty important. The second issue is the second question is in the description of the panel. What are the key issues in the way forward? We want this to be very, very practical. And the third question, which came out of the second panel, trying to link these things together, are what are the mechanisms of accountability for religious minorities? I don't want that to be a leading question, but obviously that is a leading issue here in America. And we, as a Christian and as still a Christian majority country, there are a lot of stereotypes that are out there. And so talking about what mechanisms of accountability and working together for religious minorities, all faiths and none, in the Middle East, I think is a very important and very concrete question to consider. So with that, let me introduce our guest. We have Dr. Abdul Aziz Sachouddina, IIIT ambassador, will promote you, but also professor of chair in Islamic studies at George Mason University in Virginia, just across the river. We also have Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, who was formerly the Archbishop of Washington from 2001 to 2006, and was created a cardinal by Blessed John Paul II in 2001. And finally, we have Dalia, I can never pronounce it right, Mogahed, forgive me, who speaks and writes on Arab and Muslim issues, and she's the former executive director and senior analyst for the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies. So please join me in welcoming them, and we will turn the floor over to Dr. Sachouddina.
Well, thank you very much for still being awake at this time of the day. This is the nap time. That's how, we, the ones who wake up early in the morning, this is the time we are sleepy. And I have a notice hanging outside my office, meeting in progress, don't disturb. That means I'm taking my nap. Yes, it is my meeting with my God. Who knows, right? Something that we have not considered since morning, as we have considered many issues, political, statecraft, laws, constitutions, we haven't considered one important dimension of the Arab Spring. That is the status of religious scriptures and what are they doing in providing the guidance, because that's what the people hear. People hear religious scriptures. Religious scriptures are also quite polemical because part of the function of religious scripture is to provide a sense of identity to those who are within the community. So the other is always described as less sometimes, but not equal all the time. What I want to really tease out here is a new movement in appropriating the Quranic polemics as much as solutions to the problem of interfaith and interfaith coexistence. I've just come back from a conference on coexistence in Muscat, Oman. As you can imagine, Muscati Muslims are Ibadis. They are a minority within a minority. Neither the Shia accept them, nor the Sunni accept them. They are Ibadi. They hold this conference about coexistence. It was coexistence in Islamic jurisprudence. We wanted to find out if Islamic law can really provide a shelter for those who are not part of the majority. What could that be? Tough questions were ignored. Ali Gum'a, the former Mufti of Egypt, was there. Alani, the present Mufti of Egypt, was there. Present Mufti of Damascus was there. Present Mufti of Istanbul was there. All of these big lawmakers, so to speak, were there. Those who gave the fatwas, those who guide the community. What I want to underscore is that in modern age, we are witnessing a new movement to appropriate the Quran. Because the Quran is not free of polemics. When I say polemics, that means other communities are being assessed negatively. Not only that, there's also criticism of the other communities' doctrines and ideas. It criticizes Trinity, it criticizes the chosenness of the Jewish people. All those things are part of that Quranic worldview in the 7th century. What is interesting to note is that classical exegetes have continued to explain and elaborate on these verses in a very polemical way. And they continue to do that, and they have considered it quite often. What we are noticing is a new movement that is trying to appropriate the modern exegetes and the way they look at those verses, which could now create what I call civil religion or civil society, where there is tolerance of other communities as equals, not less than equals. Because the modern nation state does not accept anything less than citizenship. If you look at Islamic jurisprudence, it does not have an idea of citizenship in it. The world is divided into believer and non-believer. The non-believers, if they happen to the peoples of the book, they are tolerated as second-class citizens. Can that work in the modern nation state? And this is the challenge for not only Muslim Brotherhood, it's the challenge in Tunisia. It's the challenge everywhere where there are minorities. It was a challenge in Iraq. I was participant in the formation of the Iraqi constitution. I was part of the International Advisory Commission. And we worked very hard on the whole question of, can we introduce Sharia in the constitution? My American colleagues were saying, no, we can't introduce it. And I said, no, we will introduce Sharia, but we'll change the meaning of the Sharia. Instead of calling it Islamic law, we'll call it a system of Islamic values. You can have Islamic values of family life, individual life, whatever you want to do, but not the laws, not the juridical corpus that was formulated in the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th centuries. That will not be applicable. In other words, we sorted out the problem in talking to the founders, to the Constitutional Committee in Najaf and in Iraq. They agreed that we need to not do away with the word, because that's what the population wants to hear. People want to hear that there is something Islamic about it. Whether we like it or not doesn't matter to them. And American policymakers were adamant that there should not be the word Islamic or Sharia in the Constitution, and the Iraqis were insisting. In other words, we have people on the ground. We haven't spoken about the people. We are still speaking about the elites. We are still speaking with the administrators. We are not speaking with the people on the streets of Cairo and other places, who will tell us exactly what they think about the non-Muslims. We need to hear from them. And unless they are convinced that these people, these non-Muslims, have equal dignity with the Muslims, we have lost our ground. In other words, we are not doing the groundwork. In our analysis, most of the time I've been hearing since morning is all that we know is people at the top talking to one another. And that's what we have done all the time. We haven't spoken to the people on the streets. What do they want? How do they treat Jews and Christians? One of the questions that emerged by asking Ali Guma, for example, was that, why don't you, I asked this very blunt question, why don't you, the jurists in Darul Ifta or anywhere else, why don't you condemn the killing of Shia population in the Sunni majority countries? Why haven't you done anything? Why don't you even name them and say that because you don't consider them to be Muslim, therefore they are no humans? In other words, there was this silence on the part of the organizers that how come we don't talk about our minorities, intra-faith minorities who are mistreated by our own people, and we don't even say anything about it. There's no condemnation of any sort. In other words, we are talking about the public, about the people. However much we might be able to do in the parliament, or we can do in the Congress, wherever we do, wherever we make those decisions, people are not participants in the political processes. And until they become participants, we will not see the change of attitude. We are looking at Ru'yat al-Alam, that they speak about the worldview. And this Ru'yat al-Alam, there are Egyptian scholars in that meeting, by the way, who are talking about Heidegger, who are talking about Foucault, but they were not talking about their own, worldview. What exactly is Ru'yat al-Alam in Islam itself? What is Islam teaching about it? Is it teaching the way the polemics are being run, or what exactly is the situation? In other words, what we are missing is the link with the public. And the public hears the religious leaders in the mosque. They are the ones who are controlling them. They are the ones who give them information. If they are the ones who are giving them information about how others have to be treated, what is the relationship between us and them, this them, quote unquote, those with whom we disagree or those who are not even Muslims, then we are talking about something that needs to go and penetrate those circles of leaders, that circle of leadership, which is actually influential in the society. People are not many times connected with the political leaders. They don't even listen to them. But they are connected with the religious leaders. And unless we are able to change their minds and their worldview in terms of what we can find in the new Quranic exegesis. In other words, my argument is that the Quran is open to interpretation. Like any scriptural text, it is open to interpretation, and the interpretation is very much controlled by the social and political ambiance of those who are interpreting it. Are we willing to interpret it now in a different way? Yes. There are 6 to 7 such exegeses. One in Indonesia, one in India, there is in Egypt, there is in Damascus. All of them are pointing towards what we call the modern world in which we are existing, and which demands that Islam and the Quran must respond to its own polemics. And how exactly that polemic, those ideas that are mentioned polemically in the Quran, how are they to be interpreted in ways in which we can create a civil society? We can create people, citizenry that is willing to live with one another. I think the explosion that we will hear will come from the seminaries, from the centers of Islamic learning. And unless that changes, I think the people will not change. Because the preachers are going from those seminaries, and they are going and they are being informed, they are being sent to those mosques in all areas, and they are the ones who are conveying the ideas. How are you going to deal with the kafirun? How are you going to deal with infidels? How are you going to deal with the peoples of the book? How are you going to deal with those who disagree with you? Among yourself, there are Salafis, there are takfiris, there are jihadis. How exactly are you going to deal with them? And unless that equation is not changed through the new exegesis, which is quite powerful, but still very much academic. The way we handle these matters, it's still very academic. It hasn't been channelized to reach the people. And unless that happens, we are bound to see problems for pluralism. Pluralism is a no-no word as far as seminarians are concerned, because it suggests the accommodation and compromise of the truth claim that belongs to the very particular group, that majority tradition. And this could really demonize and dehumanize anybody who disagrees with it. Thank you very much.
That was great. Sometimes you get up and you just want to say, wow. I said that to the professor as he passed by. Wow, that was great. Mine isn't going to be a wow, I'm sorry. I wasn't here this morning, and I'm afraid a lot of the things that I'm going to say now were things you already heard this morning. I apologize for that. I had months ago, I had agreed to do the 50th anniversary of a nun, a little sister of the poor, who was very good to members of my family when they were very old. And so I had promised I would go up there. And when we were going to have our meeting in the fall, it was no problem. But then when Sandy came, and we moved now, so I had to go up to Baltimore and then come back, and so I'm all over the place. However, I've been looking at the thing that we're looking for. This any ideas on the way forward? And I want to start by saying, that the way forward changes all the time, doesn't it? It changed even in the last 6 months when we had our program, our original program scheduled. Just look at what's happened since then. In religious changes, even in the West, we have a new pope, a man with new priorities, a man with a new position, a man who has been saying to the priests, get out of yourself and work and find the periphery, find the people down there. Begin to work with them. Don't make yourselves comfortable in your own places. That is not what God wants you to do. He wants you to reach the people. What we were saying before, the doctor was saying, very, very true. In every religion, get out to the people, see what the people are thinking. Make sure they understand what we're teaching, and make sure they understand that we're teaching with love. And this is what the Holy Father is doing. So we have a new pope. We have new patriarchs, a new head of the Orthodox Coptic Church, and incidentally a new head of the Roman Catholic, the Eastern Catholic Coptic Church. And they will make a difference in their community, especially the Orthodox Pope, because he will bring to 10 million people in Egypt a certain point of view. We have a new Archbishop of Canterbury, one of the most important of the Protestant leaders since then. So 3 very important leaders have come since we were supposed to meet here in the fall. There are changes in Muslim too. Ali Goma, who we talked about a few minutes ago, is no longer the Grand Mufti of Egypt. He's gone. The Sheikh Al-Azhar is gone. Tantawi, who was a friend of many of us here, passed away too soon. He was a good man, and now he's being succeeded. I don't know his successor. I presume he's a good man too. But we've seen all this kind of changes in people, and all this kind of changes in the problems that we face. We talk about the Arab Spring. I think it's reasonable to say that the Arab Spring has not been what many of us thought it would be. Many of us thought it would be a new flowering of not necessarily democracy, but a new flowering of getting people to understand each other and working together and things like that. That has not totally happened, as you know, as I know, in the world. And because of that, we are in a situation where anything that happens is something that worries us all. Boston, last week. We have not totally figured it all out, I don't think. And what does it mean? What does it mean for our relations with each other? What does it mean for our relationship with the Islamic world? What does it mean? I don't know yet. I'm not sure we know either. We must make sure that it is not captured by either the real right or the real left, that we try to keep in the middle and understand what is going on and be able to face problems like this, difficulties like this in the proper way. Today, just yesterday, we learned of the kidnapping of two very important Orthodox archbishops in Syria. What does that mean? Their chauffeur, their guard, whatever it was killed and they were spirited away. What does that mean? I'm not sure yet. It worries all the Christians who worry about what happens to the Christian population in these areas, we begin to worry. What this is one person, it's a group, it's a society, it's a selection, it's an accident, whatever happens. So the things are changing, and not always for the better. But when we say the way forward changes because the way backward changes too. The steps we take tomorrow have to be related somehow to the steps we took yesterday. And so we have to understand what is happening in our world. You look at some of the documents in the American tradition today. We have, as you probably know, a federal commission on international religious freedom. They're very, very disturbed at what is happening now. Is their March information issue, just 2 sentences. Recent studies have also shown that restrictions on religion are rising worldwide, and with that an increase in societal hostility and instability. Consequently, religious freedom has real national security relevancy, as conditions supporting religious freedom can help combat the rise of violent religious extremism. So that's a point of view that they are looking at. There are other things obviously happening in today's world, things that get a lot of people upset, and we begin to worry. What is the way forward? Can we pretend that there is no way back, going back to the old Orientalism, where we felt that nothing that happened in the East had any value at all? We know now, hopefully, that's not true. There's a great book that in Catholic institutions we used to read, The 13th, The Greatest of Centuries. And once doing some work at the Library of Congress, I began to read it. And it's interesting that in the index of the 13th Greatest of Centuries, there is no mention of Islam. And you could actually write a book on Islam about Islam in the 13th century and call it the greatest of centuries, because it was a time of extraordinary scholarship, of extraordinary architecture, of extraordinary culture. But we are sometimes blind to these things. So where do we begin? How do we pull this all together? The prior speaker was very thoughtful. It says, if we only deal on that top level, the elites, do we really know what's going on? And how important it is, as he also mentioned, how important it is what is being preached in the pulpit of Catholic, Christian, Hebrew, Muslim, different groups in Islam. What is being preached in the pulpits? What is going on in the local mosques, in local synagogues, in local churches, local temples, all over the world? So when you say, how do we go forward? I think we have to try to figure out where we are now before we begin to think, okay, we go forward this way and not that way. Some of us were disappointed by the Arab Spring. I remember there was one of very distinguished Saudi Arabian diplomat once said to me, it's the Arab autumn. It's not the Arab Spring anymore. And I think many of us feel that way in many countries, that the great hopes we had, the great enthusiasm we had for what could happen. Zbigniew Brzezinski has a line that's real. It is, I think, it's typical of Zbigniew, but he says, populism, this is what he feels had happened in those areas, populism can lead to democracy, but it is not of itself a democratic phenomenon. It takes time for populism to become permeated by democratic principles and the ability of compromise. Central Europe had that in the 1990s because there was a history. But so over time, it acquired democratic attributes. In the Middle East, it's a much more emotional reaction against deprivation, corruption visible at the top, unfair wealth, and the impact of mass communications. It's a phenomenon of political outrage, which can go in religious, extremist directions, or it's a gradual process. It's really much more complicated than just saying it's a democratic uprising. I think we know that now. Those who said, "Oh, the Arab Spring is a spring of democracy." Hopefully, the Arab Spring is a spring of people wanting to talk themselves, wanting to understand themselves, wanting to have a place to shout out who they are, what they want to believe, and how they want to organize their lives according to the values of the spiritual values which they have. There's I don't know, some of you may indeed know Jane Harman, who was the head of the Woodrow Wilson Center. On the second anniversary of the Arab Spring, she came up with some fascinating thoughts about it. And if I could just quickly share them with you. First, she said, transitions are always messy. Our own is still in process. From winning a war in 1776 to standing up a government in 1789 to enfranchising slaves almost a century later and women 70 years after that. Secondly, we have minimal understanding of the tribal nature of many of the countries involved. We do not understand that. We had tribal problems in our own dealing with the Native Americans. But we do not understand always that many countries in the Middle East and in Africa and Asia have tremendously important tribal roots. And these can create enormous difficulties for forging national unity. Third, an election does not make a democracy. Political skills are minimal on all sides sometimes. The notion of working together to reach compromise is often non-existent. And fourth, the rise of political Islam brings benefits and burdens. The requirements of governing can cause groups to moderate their behavior. But sadly, as we are seeing sometimes in Egypt, they can overreach and create an enormous backlash of those who are not in power. And finally, the United States has only limited ability to influence change. We were slow to embrace it and are mistrusted by many. We cannot impose or pick favorites anymore. We must carefully and wisely support and encourage pluralism and tolerance, and we must embrace homegrown and regional opportunities. We are neither coach nor captain, but we have a chance to become coach. The spring is a difficult. The Arab Spring is a difficult time. I was in Cairo just around the time of President Morsi's election, and nobody. You asked, what is this man like? And they would say, he's a good family man, and that's all they would say. And that's something to be said, but that doesn't say how he's going to govern. Others were saying 80% of how he's going to govern depends on who he talks to. And I think that's probably still true today. It's true in the United States too, it's true everywhere. And so we have to become aware of the complexity of the world around us, complexity of people around. I go on for a long time, but I don't want to, because I know even though our chairman gave us all another 5 minutes by speaking very, very rapidly and thoughtfully, just to say a couple of things. Where are we going now? Well, I think we are understanding, let's say, more than before, the complexities of interfaith dialogue, the complexities of the Middle East, the complexities of people coming out of the shadows, coming into a land, into a time where they can govern themselves. But can they really do that? Can any of us do that? Is it possible that the vox populi, the voice of the people, can really be heard? In the United States, we think it can be, but when Congress and governments get so tied up among themselves, is that what's happening? Or are we? Government cannot exist, I think, without compromise, and we are losing compromise. And what does that mean for our government? What does it mean for our future? And what does compromise mean in the Orient, in the eastern part of the world? What does it mean in Syria? What does it mean in Jordan? What does it mean in Palestine, Egypt, Tunis, and all these other places? Can people understand compromise? And Doctor was talking about the interpretation of sacred texts. There is a movement in Islam, a so-called reformist movement in Islam that looks at some of these really serious questions. The question of apostasy, you must have brought that up this morning. The question of blasphemy, you must have brought that up this morning. All these things they are not without their echo in the Christian tradition and in the Israeli tradition. They're there. We have, to a certain extent, hopefully, we have sort of overcome them, and we have reached a level where we understand them, and we watch carefully, hopefully, that this will not happen. But every once in a while, it breaks up among extremist views among the Christians. Why would we not expect it to break out in extremist views among other religions? Some years ago, and this was what I was doing for a long time, was studying the Amman message, the message that the government of Jordan put out in like 2004, 2005. It was an attempt to define Islam, and there were maybe 500 major Islamic figures signed up for it. But the point that the doctor made a few minutes ago, that wasn't the people. We had a meeting on the Common Word here about maybe a year or so ago, and I remember asking the speakers, "What about the Amman message?" And they knew what it was, but they said, "Nobody's talking about it now." So that, the people who really are being hopefully galvanized to take their own way, to understand their own feelings, to see their own relationship with each other and with God, these are the people who we have to listen to. But are they ready to speak? And do they know enough to speak? And so education is at the basis of so much that we're doing. And is education in the right hands anywhere? We were trying to do a study of textbooks in Palestine, and there are problems on every side, obviously. But that's not the way to fix the world. If youngsters get the same prejudices, no matter what they are, then they carry them on, and they carry them into the family, they carry them into their own children. And they carry them because it is now a, quote, democracy, unquote. They carry them into the schools of the future. So, when we say, where do we go from here? Well, I'm going to end by quoting a great line from a great man, Pope John Paul II, who is one of my heroes, and I think maybe the hero of a lot of us. He was in Africa some time ago. If I find it, you'll hear it. There I have found it. And he was in Nigeria, where there's been a good deal, as you know, of interreligious difficulties. This goes back about 20 years. He said, all of it, and I think this is the way, why I'm using this as my finale, is to say I think this is the only way we can go. All of us, Holy Father said, Christians and Muslims, live under the Son of one merciful God. We both believe in one God who is creator of man. We are claiming God's sovereignty, and we defend man's dignity as God's servant. We adore God and profess total submission to him. Thus, in a true sense, we can call one another brothers and sisters in faith in the one God. And we are grateful for this faith, since without God, the life of man would be like the heavens without the sun. Because of this faith that we have in God, Christianity and Islam have so many things in common. The privilege of prayer, the duty of justice, accompanied by compassion and almsgiving, and above all, the sacred respect for the dignity of man, because this, at the foundation of all, is the basic human rights of every human being. Is that the way we ought to go? I don't know of any better way. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to address you this afternoon, and thank you for coming back after lunch, despite the amazing weather on this absolutely stunning campus. I can never get over how beautiful it is here in the spring. I want to talk about, really give you more of a global perspective and maybe address some of these gaps that we've been discussing about the lack of understanding of what the public's thinking. What is the ground, the street, as we sometimes call it, saying and thinking. For almost 8 years, I was the executive director of the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, and in that role, I led the study of public opinion research in Muslim-majority countries. And so some of what I will be discussing is drawing upon that. And I want to discuss not so much the dynamics of pluralism and religious minority rights within Muslim countries, though I will touch on that, but the relationship between Muslim-majority societies, specifically Arab countries and the United States, in light of the Arab Spring and what that means for Muslim-Christian relations. And I'll start by talking about one of the most striking differences that I noticed when I first visited Egypt after the uprising, and that was the glaring absence of pictures of Mubarak. I mean, they used to be everywhere, and his watchful gaze literally followed you wherever you went, and suddenly all of these pictures almost overnight had been taken away and replaced by the Egyptian flag. The Egyptian flag was everywhere. It was on street corners, it was painted on buildings, it was in ad after ad after ad. It was as if the Egyptian people had said, we won't take it anymore. This country doesn't belong to one family and their cronies, it now belongs to us. And so it was so interesting that against this backdrop of a newfound national pride, that I also saw this very surprising Moby Neal ad. And Moby Neal is, of course, a cell phone company in Egypt and in the airport. It was so noteworthy because it had a picture of a handsome young man with an Egyptian flag painted on his cheek, which was kind of an iconic symbol of the Tahrir protesters. And the ad read in English, quote, "We should teach our children to be like Egyptian children, President Barack Obama." Now, whether or not the president actually said that is actually not the point. He may not have. What was important, though, was that in this initial post-revolution euphoria, with all this newfound confidence and national pride, Egyptians felt affirmed by American praise. Their own feeling of national success, at least momentarily, dissipated longtime Egyptian perceptions of American disrespect, which had always been a core element of anti-American sentiment in the region, according to the research that I was leading at Gallup for several years. And that's why I make the argument that a democratic, prosperous, and stable Middle East is the only path to improved relations between America and Arab countries and between Muslims and Christians. Likewise, it is the only way to protect individual rights of faith minorities, of political dissidents, of political comedians, and everyone else. Because autocratic governments historically have sold their oppression to liberal democracies in two main ways. One, they promise stability, and two, they promise the protection of religious or ethnic minorities. They make the case that if they weren't there, the majority would wipe the minority out. And so the Arab uprising took the lid off a simmering cocktail of collective frustration, mostly aimed inward. However, widespread and long-standing suspicion of US intentions in the region provided ready fodder for demagoguery amidst the climate of economic and political uncertainty. But at the same time, the US always remained an important reference point. As complicated and uncomfortable as it might seem, the only path forward is for the United States to continue to support democratic transition in the region. Now, some global analysts quickly declared the Arab uprisings of 2011 as the final obituary for Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization thesis. What better way to wrest the philosophy of an inevitable conflict between Western and Muslim societies based on the latter's supposed rejection of democracy than for millions of Arabs to rise up, mostly in peaceful protest at first, demanding bread, freedom, and social justice. For those who saw the Arab Spring as a long overdue march to freedom, the evidence was clear. Huntington's world-famous theory, which appeared to explain everything on September 11th, crumbled with each falling dictator. But then things got complicated. Islamists, not the young liberals that initially ignited the revolution, would dominate post-uprising elections, triggering fears of theocracies replacing secular dictatorships. Then a low-budget anti-Islam film released on YouTube triggered raging protests across the Middle East and beyond, purportedly in response to the online trailer's degrading portrayal of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. In contrast to the massive demonstrations in early 2011 in Egypt, Tunisia, and Yemen against domestic inequality, some of these fringe groups decided to target American and other Western embassies in the region. But it's also important to take note of this. At least 50 people were killed in these clashes, with the security forces, with clashes with security forces at these anti-film protests. And this underscores that the primary victims of extremist fervor in Muslim societies has always been Muslims themselves. So advocates of the clash paradigm appear to be vindicated at the time. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, for example, an outspoken opponent of Muslim societies and Islam, penned the controversial September 2012 Newsweek cover story, Muslim Rage, where she argued that the anti-movie protests were evidence of her claim of Muslim intolerance and Islam's incompatibility with the modern world. Others seized the election year opportunity to score political points against President Obama by declaring his Muslim outreach effort and handling of the Arab Spring an abject failure. But the Arab Spring pro-democracy uprisings have not ushered in a new wave of Muslim-West tensions, as some have claimed. On the contrary, they have opened the way for a new dynamic between the US and Muslim societies, from a perceived relationship of villain-victim to one that can ultimately become one of equal partners engaged on the basis of mutual interests. But we're not there yet. But like the American economy, where we still have a long way to go, we are certainly better off than we were 4 years ago. And here's why. It should be made abundantly clear that the attacks on American embassies and businesses were inexcusable and must always be condemned in the strongest terms. At the same time, it is worth noting that these protests were far smaller than those triggered by the Danish cartoon controversy in 2005-2006. It is simply inaccurate to allow the actions of these fanatics to define Muslim societies and their relationship with the West moving forward. This response differed from the 2006 Danish cartoon controversy qualitatively as well. rather than accuse the US as a whole of being at war with Islam, opponents of the film pursued a legalistic approach, demanding that the president take legislative action against the film. Albeit misguided, this response firmly rooted the conflict in the mundane world of law and policy, transactional, changeable, and fallible, and out of the world of irresolvable religious war. In contrast, during the era of President George W. Bush and the ongoing war on terror, the dominant narrative was that the US, specifically and the West in general, was, quote, at war with Islam. Extremist groups on both sides exploited the publication of the Danish caricatures to bolster their claims that the West in general, and the US in particular, was not only politically at odds with Muslim societies, but was waging a printed crusade to destroy Islam itself. Though he enjoys higher approval ratings than his predecessor, President Obama has his share of critics in Muslim-majority countries. Many denounce his drone program, his policies regarding the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, as well as his perceived lack of follow-through on promises made in his landmark New Beginning address in Cairo University. But even his harshest detractors do not accuse the president of seeking to destroy Islam. Instead, those who oppose Mr. Obama in Muslim societies do so on political grounds, sharply disagreeing with his policies, but not accusing him of seeking to harm them simply because they are Muslims. And this is a really significant difference. This shift in the nature of the conflict from a crusade to a conflict of interest cannot be underestimated. According to Gallup research, those who see the nature of tensions between Western and Muslim societies as driven by political rather than religious differences are also more likely to see them as resolvable. The real answer to the clash of civilizations theory is not that there is no conflict, but rather that it is not an inevitable one between civilizations. It is between competing interests, divergent perceptions, and elected leaders catering to an often suspicious domestic constituency in their respective societies. As Arab societies become more responsive to popular will, populist pandering will sometimes complicate global relations, as it often does in established democracies. But ultimately, more empowered publics will force governments to deliver pragmatic, social, and economic results. When you ask Egyptians what they want their government to focus on, what they want their government's priorities to be, whether they support Salafis or secular parties, their answers are identical, and it's about jobs, economic development, and stability. That's what people care about. So eventually, these leaders will, if we keep having elections, will either have to deliver on these priorities or be elected out of office. And these priorities require leaders to forge partnerships with the international community. So a more democratic Arab world is messier, less predictable, and requires deep engagement and dialogue, not dictates. At the same time, more successful and confident Arab societies are more likely to shed victim mentalities and take equal responsibilities for improving relations with the US. And only a democracy can protect the individual rights of all citizens. The way forward will undoubtedly be long and bumpy, but Arab democracy is the only path to robust regional stability and the protection of individual rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to each of you for a wonderful set of presentations. And most important, I've found as I travel around the world, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. And I hope you felt the the humility and honor of them addressing you and the privilege of speaking with you in the way that they did so, all three. And I think that's basically what this is all about. Some reflections. I'm supposed to summarize all this and think about it in 10 minutes or less so we can give you the floor. But I want to return to this morning's conversation and Dr. Essek, if I'm pronouncing his name properly, Essek from South Africa, because something he said, quoting his holy scriptures, back to Dr. Sachedina, where he started, really moved me. And I may have got this wrong, but this is how I wrote it down in my own notes. He said basically his life verse, which is kind of a Christian or an evangelical thing to say, so I'm using my language to express his way of saying this. His life verse was a verse from the Holy Quran that says this: "O you attendant of faith, rise as witness for justice in God, though thy may be against yourself." And I welcome the exact translation of that. But that spoke to me as a Christian. That was very powerful for me, and it gets into the founding of our country as well. Because there was an earlier comment made about schismatics in the founding of America and taking on a concrete issue. And there was a concrete issue because there had been religious wars in Europe, as we all know. But the thing that we sometimes like to forget as we build our mythical kinship bond, which is the definition of ethno-religious identity sometimes, we don't want to remember the past. We just want to believe what we want about ourselves, and we're all good people, just ask us, is that when those folks came to America, fleeing something that had been done to them, they in turn did the same to the minorities, Christian on Christian. And the person who kind of broke that cycle is a guy by the name of Roger Williams. And Roger Williams said something that echoed for me as I heard Dr. Essek say that from the Holy Quran. He said, "Forced worship stinks in the nostrils of God." And I'm not going to respond to you as a fellow Puritan. I'm not going to respond to you as an Anglican or even a colonial American. I'm going to respond to you as a follower of Christ, because my holy scriptures teach me to be that way. And I think that is fundamental in terms of how we understand these kinds of things, which also brings us to a fundamental problem in our own societies. And as I travel worldwide, I will speak only about my own faith tradition. But there is a strong case for biblical illiteracy. We don't know our own scriptures, and I might add, on behalf of my Muslim friends anecdotally, they would also say that they don't know the Holy Quran as well. And so there is a profound need for ongoing theological discussion, which gets into seminaries and madrasas, about who are trained to teach the scriptures and apply that to a practical life beyond the building of the church or the mosque. Sometimes I think we're just producing seminary pastors to deal with the building. What about the body of Christ in Christian talk that's out there outside the building? And I think good Muslims are asking the same questions. But the other part of this, and I think this is true of Muslims, but again, I speak as a Christian, is that Christians need to be in the habit of admonishing each other in wisdom about what the scriptures say. This is Paul from Colossians 3. Everyone's teaching everyone. This whole thing, common word, is based on love God, love neighbor from Leviticus 19:18. Leviticus 19:17 says, paraphrased, rebuke or be a part of the problem. We got to get good at admonishing in wisdom, which is a nice way of saying rebuke, within our own holy traditions. Get back to the scripture. Are you practicing a faith or a religion? Now, they're both good words, but just to provoke and poke a little bit, faith for me is where the mystery and majesty and mercy of God is always there. Religion is, I know all the answers. It becomes an ideological checklist. I absolutely believe in an absolute, but I know as a human, I can't know the absolute absolutely. Which means we ought to have some humility, which is what the good cardinal was talking about, and for which I am also very grateful. He reminded me as he spoke of some friends. We work in Pakistan and Syria, and some friends of mine over in Pakistan once said to me, quoting I think the Holy Quran, forgive me if I don't have this right, but there is knowledge beyond knowledge. That's a profound statement. That echoes Isaiah 55. Your ways are not my ways, says God. We really need to be profoundly humble about this kind of stuff and be open to how others understand religious freedom, which I note was not answered by any of you. So, how do you define religious freedom? My 2-cent definition is the freedom to choose, change, or share faith, or have none at all. I use the word share instead of proselytize. Proselytize is in all the international covenants, but has a negative connotation. Share to me suggests that I'm going to get to know you and show respect for who you are. Like I said, I've spoken in madrasas in Pakistan and Syria. It wasn't hard to find Waldo in those pictures. But after my presentations, it was a curious thing. I was approached by devout Muslims afterwards, and basically in English American, finish your journey. Just come on board, jump on board for the big win and finish your journey and join Islam. You're almost there. Now, I can, if I got a religion, I can take offense at that. If I have a faith, I can say this: thank you for caring so much about my soul that you would want to share your faith with me. And if you truly respect me, just understand that we are going to continue to disagree about the divinity of Christ. I believe he's the Son of God. The Holy Quran says he was born of the Spirit of God. We're this close, and it's irreconcilable, theologically speaking. That's okay. I'm okay with that. But if we can name our differences in a multi-faith way, then maybe we can begin to move together on the things we have in common, like compassion and justice and mercy and peace, and taking our holy scriptures seriously. So, as the Cardinal said, we really need to have patience in all of this stuff, because we need to be looking forward, because our future runs through our past. And we need to look back and have some truth-telling and some mercy on both sides to have honest conversations about what practical mechanisms are for accountability and whatnot. Another question not answered. And then we had Dahlia, who I think put a nice, very fine cap on the whole thing, which is to say this, and this is why I work for religious freedom, because I think it's the right thing to do according to my faith and as an American, but it's also, as Tom Farr said, to do, don't look at it as a Western thing, look at what works. Democracy is, as Winston Churchill once said, the worst system, except for all the others. It is a safe space, and we are to steward that space as citizens before a constitution that is hopefully relevant to all citizens. At our organization, we like to say we work at the intersection of culture and the rule of law. Culture, because if a culture doesn't own it, then the solution will never be sustainable. It has to come from within. And every culture, every faith has a mechanism for respecting the other, even if it's only hospitality for the stranger. But at the same time, culture can sometimes be used as an excuse not to take on what I would consider to be universal values found in all faiths. And that's why the rule of law is so important. Equal citizens under the law who can speak their faith traditions and their values into a civic religion of a common moral framework where the other is not assimilated to look like the majority culture, but integrated and respected and celebrated for who they are at the core of their identity. I think that's consistent with the Abrahamic faiths and all the others. But we have to be able to talk about it in a comfortable fashion, and that's why democracy is so important. How do you create that space? And then allow for the fact that violent conflict does not have to be inevitable, but conflict is inevitable because we have irreconcilable theological beliefs, and they can sometimes manifest themselves in irreconcilable political solutions. The trick is just not to be angry about it. You're still a human. I still love my sister in humanity, Dahlia. We disagree about some things theologically. but I'll go anywhere and die for her to have her right to live her faith. I say that seriously. I'm the fourth of 8 Marines in 2 generations of disciples, 7 of whom were infantry guys. That's what this country is about. That is the essence of our exceptionalism, lowercase e. Okay, I think that's all I've got to say about that. But I'd like to open the floor to questions. We're going to go till about 3:30, so we have 25 minutes. It is open. Please come on down. We'll just start here on your right and then alternate as we go until we run out of time.
Hello, my name's Rick Gold. This is for Dahlia. In Egypt, the rule of thumb is that there are about 10% of the population is Coptic Christian. But as you know, it's been very difficult to collect data. And recently, the Coptic Pope said that they were 20% of the population. I'm wondering what the possibility for getting better data on the percentage or numbers of Christians within Egypt and what that might mean for the future understanding of relationship between the religions.
Well, I think the hope for getting better data is really an unknown, but the government should have very accurate numbers that it doesn't release, because when they do a census, one of the questions is on religious identity. So if they're counting every citizen and asking them that question, they should actually have an exact number. But probably for reasons, political reasons, they don't want to release that number, and they never have. I mean, during the Mubarak, before the uprising, as well as after. It's not a number that they want to release. Now, there are polls and other ways that people have tried to find the exact number, but they're, of course, less accurate than a census, which is what the government could provide.
I'm Judy Syed from Charlottesville, where we desperately miss Professor Satchedina still. I'm also a Roman Catholic, married to a Muslim from Egypt. Both of us are active in our faith traditions. So I come naturally to the interfaith circle. And I was very excited when A Common Word was published. I thought this is a wonderful document, and it certainly has been doing a wonderful job as a resource in building bridges of understanding among scholars. I feel that we do not have the space in this country where we are celebrating the faiths of the minorities. And I think that the minorities, and particularly Islam, is too often defined by the media. And I think that's a huge, huge mistake. And I feel that A Common Word could be used to build bridges of understanding among the population in our communities. So I'm wondering if there is any consideration being given to using A Common Word with its corresponding verses from the Quran and from Gospels as a framework or as a tool for guiding us in the community as we try to do our interfaith work.
Thank you. I would love to speak on behalf of John Esposito, but I won't. Do you want a quick answer, John?
I think that there are two things here. One is that one of the problems you have with A Common Word is analogous to the problem with the Amman message, is analogous to many statements that are made by either single major religious leaders or groups of religious leaders. Some of them, and I must say, some of the statements are simply political, and half the people don't believe in them. But you have others that people really believe in, but they just say it and nobody talks about how do we institutionalize it, okay? So that's one issue. And I think Common Word has suffered from that. The question, who's going to carry this forward? You know, is there an institutional approach to carrying it forward? The Jordanians behind it have somewhat carried it forward, but nowhere near what they intended. There was a special committee that was formed, an international committee or council. We met for over a couple of years. It included major religious leaders, people like Tony Blair, et cetera. Nothing happened with that. On the other hand, there are lots of folks that are using Common Word. I have a friend in the Philippines. They adopted it to deal with situations in the southern Philippines. And so there are many people who've taken the document or the approach and used it. And some we're aware of, those of us who are visible dealing with Common Word. But lots of times they don't bother to connect. And so it is out there. But it's not in any way really significant in terms of, let's say, visibility, certainly in the U.S. I speak all over the U.S., and whether they're Muslim audiences or not, I'll ask how many have heard of the Amman message, how many have heard of Common Word, and you're lucky if 3 hands go up or 4 fingers. I mean, it's basically it. Yeah.
Thank you, John. Dr. Sajid.
I want to add something to what John has said. I think most of the time in these kinds of movements and conferences, we are talking to the converted. And these are the, very civil, people who even if they disagree with each other, they are willing to, sit together and discuss these things. The outreach program has not been really implemented. And that outreach program is where we can go into the public and involve the public in that conversation. That conversation, unless it reaches the public, I find it very hard to really talk about the Quranic common word or the biblical common word and bring people together on the same platform. I think it's not only that the people are not interested, but we have not generated interest in them. And I think most of us are in the academic world and we operate in the ivory tower. We don't care for the public. But that's where the problem is. Joe Montville was here. We went together to Crocker College. And I remember we were speaking about pluralism, and I, by mistake, said Catholics were Christians. And I was corrected by students that Catholics are not Christians. This is the cream of the society. These are, being educated in the modern institutions. And I was corrected, said, no, Catholics are not Christians. So I'm not surprised when I say, oh, Shia are not Muslim. I'm not surprised. Because part of the problem is that we have never reached out to the public. And I think that's where I think our efforts need to direct. Public outreach is limited, the way we are approaching the whole question.
Please.
My name is Syed Asfar Iqbal. I'm from Islamabad, Pakistan. My question is directed to Professor Sachadina. And I would like to ask you, especially in the backdrop of Pakistan, which is a very complicated society with a complicated religious system, with lots of intra-sect, which host both jurisprudence, 4 school of thoughts, and maybe 6 or more Sufi school of thoughts. Problem between Shia and Sunnis, which results in lots of killings, is our everyday life. So what do you think could be a most convincing argument from community, especially civil society, towards the Muslim clergy or the religious clergy of the country, how to engage and how to bring them to a table where we can talk about first intra-sect and then maybe interfaith? Thank you.
I think the first step to take is to recognize that there is a sense of victimhood in the minority, and the majority is the one that is implementing that behavior over them. I think there has not been a recognition of the victimhood of the Shia minority. And I think that is the first step where the leaders need to sit down and openly discuss the issues that confront the Muslim community, interfaith Muslim community. And I think once they are able to open this dialogue, which is internal dialogue, An internal dialogue cannot occur if one group thinks it's on the truth and the other group is not on the truth. Dialogue presupposes equality of the two parties. That's the respect that is needed. And I don't think that conversation has occurred in Pakistan. On the contrary, you find in Iraq that conversation is going on between the Shia ulama and the Sunni ulama. In Lebanon, same thing. The Shia ulama and the Sunni ulama are talking to one another and trying to appease their own public that they cannot continue to show that kind of animosity towards one another. I think once that is achieved, then you can begin to correct so many other things that are historically handed down as part of the heritage. I think that heritage needs to be confronted very squarely. My friend Joe Montville would have said, we need political psychology to break that vicious circle of victimizing and victimhood. Once that is done, then we can speak about how to treat one another.
Thank you. Imam Muhammad Bashar Arafat from Civilizations Exchange and Cooperation Foundation. I would like to ask the speakers about the importance of the spiritual education and the integration of the spiritual factor in the theological debate between Muslims and Christians, and the lack of the spiritual component in educating the new imams and the priests in terms of the similarities and the oneness when it comes to spirituality, the spiritual factors and the challenges which is facing pluralism today. Thank you.
If I might begin on that one, there is a rather extensive movement in the Catholic Church in the United States that is promoting ecumenism in Christian areas and interreligious dialogue in areas with Muslims and Jewish people. And I was just at a meeting a couple of weeks ago where where the leaders of this, the bishops and other major Protestant leaders are getting together and talking about how we should move on this. And it is something that doesn't come of itself, and that's the bad part of it. You have to create a desire for it, and then build a mechanism for it, and then get it around to the grassroots people. When the doctor was saying earlier, you've got to get down to the grassroots people. And John Esposito said a few moments ago, what is happening so often in these great documents, common word, Amman message, is that they never went anywhere because they didn't sink down. Forgive me that it's the wrong figure to use, but it didn't get down where the people are. And I don't know what the answer is, except that perhaps if in our seminaries and if in all the training areas for the ministers of the word, be it the Quran or the Gospel, or the Old Testament, if the ministers of the word would make sure that they take this as one of their obligations, especially in the United States. We are more than ever in a multi-religious population, and we are going to have all kinds of problems among ourselves if we don't get to know what the rest of the world believe and see the beauty of it. And see the relationship. That the last thing I read you from John Paul II, where he talks about we are so much together. We believe in one God. We believe in the importance of faith. We believe in the common word, taking care of your neighbor. And there's so many documents in the Quran that say this. Unfortunately, and there are documents in the book of Gospel says, unfortunately, the people who get the most publicity are the Christians who don't live this way and the Muslims who don't live this way. And that, I think, keeps people from moving forward and getting the understanding of how beautiful this is. It's like the mosaic, and the mosaic is a gift of God. And we should try to work on that, but it takes time.
To honor the 4 remaining questions, if you could each state your question succinctly, and then we'll ask the panel to respond to all 4.
Sure, I'm Billy Ford from Freedom House. My question's for Dalia. Just in terms of your understanding of, or essentially your rebuttal of Samuel Huntington's theory, you seem to say that we're from an intractable religious conflict between the Islamic world and the West to a political or civil conversation. What happens when politics and religion are become merged as one, when the law is, there's civic law and religious law are unified? Can you separate out a political conflict from a religious conflict in that sense?
I actually have a related, my name is Ira Weiss, I'm representing no one. Conflict, my question is related actually. It was discussed earlier by one of our earlier speakers about Islam, and it's true actually of most of the Abrahamic faiths, that there are at least many people who believe that the scripture involved, the Quran or the Torah or the Bible, is actually the literal word of God. And in that literal word of God, there are requirements to propagate it and to propagate the truth and to fight untruth and so on. Given that that's true actually of all the Abrahamic faiths, can you really have a true civic democracy with freedom of religion unless you also have separation of church and state?
I'm Tom Michel. I'm here at Georgetown University, and my question is also for Dalia. I don't know how often they do this, but Gallup has a poll, maybe it's every 4 months, every 6 months, whatever it is, but I've seen a number of them. And basically it says, what do you think of people from various countries? And every time they do it, there's a real consistency to it. The Canadians always, we have very positive reaction, like 97% of, we have good opinion of Canadians. And then almost as high as is the British, and then Finns. What do you think of Finns? Well, everybody likes the Finns. And then, you know, Israelis are a little bit lower, maybe 75%, and then the French are always down a little bit lower than 70%. Goes on down, but when you get into like, what do you think of the Egyptians? And maybe only about 35% will have a good impression of Egyptians, or Pakistanis. Oh, lower yet, maybe about 25%. Well, what about Palestinians? Maybe it's down to 15%. And always the lowest is Iran, is about 12%, something like that. These figures I'm just making up, but they're pretty accurate. They're much like what it is. My question is, most of these people who've been asked, they've never met a Finn or a Palestinian or a Pakistani. And so their impressions are coming from the opinion makers in the United States, whether it be politicians or media or whoever. So that it seems to me, well, I always wonder, you know, from this Gallup poll that we get, what conclusions can we draw? I think usually we draw the wrong conclusion. That is that there's something wrong with these people, like the Iranians who get a very low opinion rating. Whereas I think what it says much more is the power of those who shape opinion to kind of form the way we think about others. And so I'd like your opinion on that.
So my name is Hisham Melaksus. I'm from Algeria. So from the three speakers, I got like 3 key words. So the first word is citizenship, like change of meaning, like through time. So citizenship, like in the early 14th century, so used to mean inhabitant of a city. Then late 14th century became inhabitant of a country. Then later, like in the 15th century, become from the Greek word cosmopolites or cosmopolites, it became like inhabitant of the world. The second word here is like Arab Spring versus Arab Autumn. I think we'll stick with the spring, because spring, like in old Germanic language, used to mean or still means a leap or like a rapid movement. So should expect or like drastic changes should have been expected or should be expected. The third word is pluralism. So pluralism, like from 1818 is from the word from the church administration is like recognition of more than one principle or a theory that opposes monolithic power. So I think the key word is like accepting or toleration of diversity. We are here like to, the conference today is about the common word. I think Thomas Paine, one of the American founding fathers and author of Common Sense, said that all the world is my country, humanity is my religion, and all human beings are my brothers. I think the key word is like here to tolerate. And I think one key word from you, Mr. Chair, is wisdom. So there are three ways of learning wisdom. So the first way is by imitation, which is the easiest. The second way is by experience, which is the bitterest. And the third way is by reflection, which is the noblest. I think these people of the Arab Spring did the revolutions themselves. I think we should not like teach them or dictate to them or tell them what to do. I think we should maybe accept, tolerate, and try to understand and let them like decide themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Well said. Dalia, maybe we can start with you. You had two questions. Then Your Eminence, if you could take the question on separation of church and state and Abrahamic conceptions of truth, and Dr. Satjigia, if you could take this last one.
I think the question from the gentleman from Freedom House is an excellent one and a very difficult one. How do you separate between political conflict and religious conflict when there's such a melding of the two in so many places? But I would start with our own country. I mean, if anyone thinks that, the abortion debate or the gay marriage debate is not about religion at some point, but it's still a political debate. We haven't figured it out. It's not clean and cut and dried. It's not simple. Human beings have a lot of things that impact our perception of things and our decision making, and one of them is our religious beliefs, and that happens everywhere, including, of course, here in our country. But what I do mean is that when people perceive conflict, and this is simply how they themselves are telling us that they perceive the conflict, as one about a difference in political interests, that is a good thing. And more, that is how conflict, the ongoing conflict between the United States and many Muslim majority societies is being perceived. That is one contribution that President Obama has made that he doesn't get credit for, is he shifted the conversation and the rhetoric and the way people talk about the United States from a country waging a religious crusade against Islam to one that is practicing unpopular political foreign policy against Muslims. That's excellent. That's a great shift. We should celebrate because you can do something about policies and political decisions. But when it's perceived as a religious war, it's inevitable and it's unsolvable. And I'll just briefly comment on what shapes public opinion. It's a great question. A lot of things shape public opinion. Why do people, approve so highly of the Finns and not of the Palestinians? Well, the Finns have a much better image in the media, or maybe the lack thereof. And I think it's interesting. It goes the other way as well. I saw one survey that said that 90% of Muslim exchange students who had never met an American and were coming to the United States before they'd ever set foot here, 90% of them believed Americans were friendly. And yet they had never met one. And I think that that's also a testimony. And now these same exchange students had very negative views of our foreign policy, but thought Americans were friendly. And that is testimony to our popular culture and how we've been able to humanize the American people, even when people disagree with our policies.
I think with regard to separation of church and state, everything that Dalia said is the answer to that. Thank God we have a separation of church and state, because if we do, then we can do what Dalia was saying is the only way we're going to cure this. As long as people believe that our nation has a religious desire to shape them in our own way, we're really going to have a terrible time with them. But if people say, okay, they may have this religion or that religion or a bunch of religions, and that's that, then they have politics. And we can be very annoyed at American politics. I think many of us often are. But so that if you have non-Americans annoyed at American politics, that's perfectly all right. But we don't stand for one religious point of view. Unfortunately, I say as a religious person, the American religiosity today is more the enthronement of a secular religion than anything else. And I think many of us who are religious find that to be a very unfortunate thing. But at any rate, we do have a separation of church and state. It has worked for us. We have been able to do great things. We've been able to give our people a freedom, a real democracy, an opportunity to shape things. Sometimes we don't like the way they're doing it, but they are able to do it. But I think that's one of the great gifts of America. And I think many of us feel that would be a great gift to any country in the world, because once you have the priests making politics, you end up in having unpriestly politics, and that doesn't work.
I think that I want to produce a caveat here that if you don't have a church as an institution in any tradition, then what exactly is the source of conflict then? And Islam doesn't have a church. Nobody can claim to represent the totality of the Muslim community. Even the Ayatollahs in Iran, there's a plurality of the Ayatollahs. There's not only one, there are several of them. In other words, there is already a system that does not entertain, does not invest authority in one institution to make a ruling for everyone in the world of Islam. The Saudis tried to do that, the Salafists tried to do that, and they were defeated. After 9/11, you don't hear much about their influence. But what I think is important to keep in mind is that native solutions to the native problems are far more enduring than the solutions that are introduced from outside. I think many times we as Americans, we feel like teaching others about what they can do about their own system. But we are not invited as such. And I think what we need to restrain ourselves from is that the native understanding of the concepts, even like citizenship or even anything like constitution, is far more enduring because they will be discussing within their own culture and provide the legitimacy for it. I think that legitimacy is far more enduring than what we can do. I'm looking at the human rights situation, and one of the reasons why UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, has not been provided with cultural legitimacy in Muslim world is that Muslims have not participated in most of the dialogues in the early days in 1940s. So really you are out. You are not part of it. It's not only Muslims, even Christian theologians have not participated. The secularists took over, and that's what they did. And now they're imposing it on the world, and therefore there's a resistance. I don't mean to say the resistance is justified. What I'm suggesting here is that we should be very careful crossing the boundaries of the culture. And that culture in which we are going to work, I think requires us, and it behooves us to be sensitive to that culture. And I think that culture is what can really produce today the coexistence that we're looking for. What I was really surprised to find in Muscat conference was not only there was no discussion about spirituality, it was thoroughly legal, juridical. Islamic emphasis is on jurisprudence, how correctly you live. And there is no discussion about our relationship to God in which spirituality can play a role. And unless spirituality really gets that centrality the way it gets in Christianity, by the way, Because I regard myself to be Muslim Christian. Please don't get me wrong, because I'm influenced by Christianity. I was brought up in Jesuit tradition. I went to the school in Jesuit school in Tanzania. So I know exactly how I was taught. And we had Miss Jane living in our home. She used to take me every morning in the early morning mass of the Catholic Church. In other words, I found a lot of spirituality. And I don't mind thinking that I'm a Muslim Christian or I'm a Muslim Jewish. My colleague David Novak tells me that, you know, we can belong to 2, 3 concentric circles. You don't have to be limited only to your Muslim ummah. You can be part of the ummah of Moses. You can be part of the ummah of Jesus and learn from all of them whatever you need to learn and remain firm and anchored in one ummah. I think that's the solution we are looking for as a common word, but that can come only through spirituality. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sajidina. Good word to end on. We're adjourned. Come back in 15 minutes. Thank you, panel.